friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm finally getting around to shooting that update on making a yeast bread without the conventional dry yeast you get from the store. And I'm talking about using your fermentation starter that I have a whole bunch of videos on to make this. Now, if you want to know how to make the fermentation starter, it is an easy process. I'm going to put two links down below. One is going to be the shortened version and an older video showing just how to make the fermentation starter. And then I'm going to put a second video that is more than twice as long, but goes through a lot of questions and answers I get about the fermentation starter, like how to keep it alive, how long will it last, what fruits can I use, etc., etc., etc. So I try to cover all the bases. So I'll link to them both. So you can watch the first one if you just want to know quickly how to get it going. But the second one I recommend if you want to learn all the many uses and all the other things that you might want to know about it. So I have two fermentation starters here. This one is a berry one made from both wild pick blackberries, and I can hear it fizzing in there, and some freeze-dried raspberries, and then this one's made from organic raisins. And so I'm going to be using both of those in this particular one. So actually this way of making bread is the easiest way just of making bread at all. However, it takes longer time in order to just allow it to sit. So you want to at least plan a day ahead. Now the first video I did, I said 2 to 3 days, but I've been trying to work on how can I shorten the time and still get a fairly decent rise out of my bread. And so this is what I've come up with so far. Now I might still be experimenting and working with better ways, but this way is going to be the easiest yet. Now I'm working with smaller amounts at a time. I'm just making little loaves like this. If you want to make a loaf double or quadruple that size, then either double, triple, or quadruple the amount that I'm using here. So again, you'll want your fermentation starter going first. That's going to take 3 days, so get busy on that if you haven't yet. So I'm going to go half and half, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in about a total of 1 cup of my fermentation starter. So I'm just using both because, well, I want to keep them both alive. And they both have different activities. I noticed that usually a raisin one is really good, but I'm noticing that my berry one has been staying more active than the raisin. So that's another reason why I want to use them both. And obviously you can see I used more of the berry. I actually really like the flavor the berry's been adding to the bread, but the raisin makes a nice flavor too. So what I'm going to do real quick is feed both of these. Let's put a little more sugar in that one since I used more of that. And then top them off with my filtered rainwater and whatever healthy water you have. I do recommend filtering it in some way, and city tap water you should avoid because it has chlorine in it, but at least dechlorinate the water. And I have a video on how to do that I will go ahead and link down below. Top that off with some water there. And yes, you can change out your fruit every so often. Again, I discuss that stuff in that video. So any questions you may have about this will likely be answered in that longer video I'll be linking down below. Okay, so I have about a cup in there. I'm not really measuring it out. But whatever you do, you're going to want to use about an equal amount of flour in this. And you can use a bowl or you can use a jar. If you're going with making more and you want to use a jar, then I recommend using a quart size jar to get this started in. Either way, you're going to want something that you can put a tight fitting lid on. I'm going to put in about equal amounts of flour. So I'm going to start with about a 1/4 cup there. And I got this tip from Angie over at Angie's Pantry, is the use of garbanzo flour. Now, I don't know that I noticed a difference in the rise by using the garbanzo bean flour or chickpea flour, but I did like the overall feel and texture of the bread. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a little bit of that. I don't want too much though. I think too much can give it probably a beany flavor, and I don't really want that in the bread. I'm not done. I'm going to add a little bit more flour. Should be very liquidy. Now this is whole grain, fresh ground flour. Here's the other thing I found in my experiments is the whole grain ones actually seem to have a better rise than the ones I make with a half and half blend of unbleached flour and the whole grain flour. So this was freshly milled just a few minutes ago. And I think part of the reason for that is I have a couple of hypotheses. I don't know if this is this is accurate without looking it up, but I think part of it is that there's probably something about the fresh ground flour is going to make a difference there. But I also believe because I use a blend of hard white wheat and spelt, I think the spelt is one of the things that's really been helping with the rise, because spelt will do that. It is higher in gluten, but that gluten gives it a better and stronger rise that will hold better. And I think that's why. I just noticed in side-by-side comparisons when I did a jar of, because another reason I was doing small batches at a time, even smaller than this, was so I could see the difference. And I found that the whole grain flour actually bubbled up quicker and had a better overall general rise than the mix of the two, which I thought was very interesting, because I thought the weight of the whole grains would make it heavier and thus make it harder to rise. So you want this pretty liquidy, but you want it blended well. So it's pretty runny. You don't have to actually measure it out real well. Just make it so it's kind of runny. There's a reason for this, and here's why. You want to try to start this early in the day, because if you start it in the morning, that would even be best. And then around, somewhere in the afternoon, feed it about a tablespoon or so of flour. And then in the evening before you go to bed, feed it one more time. And then when you get up in the morning the next day, feed it again and stir that in there. So it should be, because the amount of fermentation starter, it should be bubbly if you start it in the morning, or if you're like me and you're starting it at noon, then it should be pretty bubbly by evening. I'll be back in the next clip with the next steps. All right, well, I'm back. It's been about 24 hours since I did the first part of this video when I first started this bread. And I have fed it flour twice since. So I fed it about 6 hours after starting it yesterday, and then again this morning I fed it, and now it's been another 6 hours. So twice I gave it a little bit of flour. And so now right here what I'm going to put is a little video clip showing a close-up of this jar and what it looks like right now, because that's what it should look like. You should be able to see a lot of little bubbles all along the jar, and that will let you know it's active and lively. You should be able to see that by the end of the day or middle of the day if you start it in the morning. Now, you want to get on this soon, because it does take a longer rise time than when you're using a dry yeast. Even though it's very active and bubbly, you're still going to need to give it more time to rise than you would your average. Think of it more as sourdough. Sourdough takes longer. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take all this and I'm going to put it in my bowl. And I'm also going to put a close-up picture right here so you can see what this looks like from the top of the jar looking down, because you should be able to look and see a lot of bubbles in there, and it should look rather poofy. Okay, so make sure you have a bowl ready to go. You're just going to take a spatula, some kind of rubber or silicone spatula, and you're going to dump that right into your bowl. Preferably a glass bowl, that's going to be best. You don't want metal unless you know it's stainless steel. Now, before I add any more flour to this, the next thing I want to do is put in my salt or any other ingredients that I might want to add. All I'm adding to this, besides flour, is salt. And so I'm going to put in, this is a small batch, so I'm putting in only about a half of a teaspoon. So if you're doubling it, obviously a teaspoon, and if you're quadrupling, then you're going to want to go about 2 teaspoons. Okay, then stir that in really good. Then just start adding your flour little bits at a time and stir. You're not actually going to knead this bread. You're just going to stir in the flour. Whoop. There I go again, throwing it all over the counter. Just stir in that flour until it starts to pull together really good and you can't stir it anymore. Because I found going with the no knead way with this, I get a better result from it than when I actually knead it. Though I prefer to make a kneaded bread, and I have done this before and kneaded it and made a really good pizza crust. So I'll put a picture of that right here. The pizza I made using this method. I did a little bit differently than I'm doing here, but obviously I added enough flour so that I could knead it so I could shape it. That's where a kneaded bread is really important. So I'm not doing measurements on this flour again. I'm just adding it in until I get it to where it's really pretty much almost impossible to stir it, which is pretty close to being there now. So it's somewhere between a bread dough and a batter. And that looks pretty good. I think I'm just going to do a tad bit more flour. Kind of press it in there. See how it's all pulling together and it's pulling away from the side of the bowl? That's what you want. Now I can get away with going with a real small pan because this is just a small batch. So I'm using this one and I've preheated it with a little bit of coconut oil in there. So I recommend, don't get it too hot. You should be able to still touch it. You just want it warm so that will help get that going faster. And then you're just gonna dump that in there directly into whatever baking pan you're gonna use, your bread pan or whatever. This fits real nicely into my toaster oven, so that's where I'm going to do that. And there we go. And now you're going to cover it with a clean towel, a rag or something clean anyway. And then put it in a warm place where it can rise. It's going to need, it could possibly need as much as 3 hours rise time. This is why you got to kind of plan ahead when you're working with this. So what I'm going to do, the warmest place I have right now is right next to my dehydrator out in the foyer there. So I'm going to go ahead and put that there. So now I'm just going to let that rise, and then I'm going to go ahead and bake it in my oven. You don't want your oven any hotter than 400 degrees. I would say about 375, and then bake it for at least 20 minutes and then check it. It's probably going to need about 30 minutes total, but check it first after 20 minutes to see how it's coming along. And now here are my fermentation starters. I left them out from the fridge all last night. They're nice and bubbly since I fed them and added more water, and so now I'm going to put them back in the refrigerator until I need them again. Now, I'm sure a lot of you by now have already gotten into sourdough making, especially with the way things are and knowing that yeast is either very hard or impossible to get, or if you can find it, it's incredibly expensive. You've probably decided to get into sourdough making. Now, I've made sourdough. I've made my own sourdough starter before. It's a super easy process, and maybe I'll make a video on that someday, but it is really easy to get your own sourdough starter made. And that is one option too that you can do instead of this. Now, the reason I prefer this method over sourdough is I just like the flavor. It's a sweeter bread rather than that more sour flavor that you can get from a sourdough. However, if you like that flavor and you want to use this method and not have to worry about keeping a sourdough starter alive all the time and feeding it and all that, this is an easy method to do that with. All you have to do is let it do that whole feeding method, but do it like once a day and do that for up to 3 days. And by day 3, you're going to have that nice, real tart flavor that a lot of people like in a sourdough. So it's a way that you can take this and sort of convert it into more of a sourdough, because it's the same idea. It's fermenting and it's taking on that sour flavor. But I like this method better because I find it so much easier. Even if I want to go for a sourdough flavor, I find it much easier keeping a fermentation starter alive because it's just pretty much hassle-free. And I don't have to worry about it. And I use the fermentation starter for so many other things that it's constantly getting used and it's constantly getting fed and refreshed. And so again, don't forget to check out that longer video I'm going to be posting down below on the fermentation starter, how to use it, how to make it, where I also talk about some of the many different ways you can use it and how to keep it refreshed. You can keep it alive for years. It's actually very easy. But even if for some reason you forget about it and it turns to wine, either use the fruit in that for something else or toss it to your chickens. My chickens love that fruit. And start another batch. It only takes 3 days to get a good fermentation starter going. That's it. And so you don't have to wait that long. All right, so since I'm going to be baking this later, I'll go ahead and put a picture right here of the finished product so you can see how that turned out. Again, remember, it's just a little small loaf. What you can do is like today, what I should do is if I want some bread tomorrow, is I get another little jar started with a fermentation starter and the flour. And if you do that every day and either make smaller batches or every other day and just keep up on it, then you can always have bread. You saw how easy it was to whip it together, no kneading. It only took a couple minutes to just add in a little salt and a little flour and then put it in the pan. It's super easy. Then you just gotta wait. Of course, you have to wait for it to rise and then bake it, but the work that goes into it is actually a lot faster, a lot easier than your standard bread. So I also would like to put in a picture here because I have actually made a full loaf using the fermentation starter. This is what it looked like. It was a very good bread. That one in particular, I used a raisin fermentation starter only in that one, and it was really good. But I plan on continuing experimenting with this and doing different things, also going back to using the kneaded bread. But I will admit that the reason I got away from using the fermentation starter for bread making was because I always have a lot of dry yeast. I still have tons of dry yeast on hand because I always kept well stocked up on it. If I want to make a bread and decide today I'm going to make pizza crust, then I can pull out the dry yeast and do that and not have to wait till tomorrow to do it. But now that we're seeing this price hike on yeast and it not being as available as it once was, I have been intentionally getting back into using the fermentation starter because that's something I can always have going. As long as you have some kind of fruit or ginger, you can always have a fermentation starter. So especially if you have a garden of your own and you have berries, apples, peaches, whatever it is, you can use that. Or if you grow your own ginger. And you don't have to worry about depending on the store to provide yeast for you. Oh yes, you need sugar too. But here's another thing. Yes, you can use honey. I've made fermentation starters with honey and pineapple, I think was the one I used with honey. I don't typically do that because honey is so much more expensive for us. But if you're already keeping bees, that might be the option. Use the honey, use whatever fruit you're growing, and a little bit of water. You can make a fermentation starter. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this bread making video and more ways you can use your fermentation starter or to get away from having to depend on store-bought yeast. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.